Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the sweltering hush of a Yazoo River summer, where candlelight quivers in cut crystal, and the air itself tastes faintly of metal. The table at Harrowick gleams with ceremony duck lacquered in wine, sugared pears, a cake iced like new plaster, and 12 smiling mouths lean closer to their ruin as the grandfather clock smooths its hands toward 7. You stand at the threshold between kitchen and parlor, apron spotless, heartbeat not, and you feel the room draw breath, the way a body does before it screams. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there. And we'll dive into tonight's journey together. Grace is being said, glasses lift, the second hand drags. At first it is only a wrinkle in a child's nose, a hand to a throat, the smallest pause over vegetables glossed in cream. Then the first cough seeds the next, and the next. A rough music climbing the throat of the house. Wine goes black on linen. A chair buckles. Someone whispers prayer into their napkin and finds no mercy there. Only threads and breath and a taste that won't let go. Night slides in through the shutters with magnolia and damp, carrying heat like a fever that won't break. You do not move. Your fingers hold the door frame, the way old roots hold riverbank mud. In the polished sideboard, the room reflects itself, double flames, double faces, double helplessness, and in the glass, you are only a smear no one will name. The bell pull hangs unused. The doctor sleeps 3 miles west. The horses dream in their halter shadows. The clock mouths 7, then 7 again, as if time itself were choking when the first body folds. Forks skitter like silver insects, and every eye finds the kitchen, as if the doorway could answer back. You were not born on this land, yet it swallowed you whole. In 1828, at just 20 years old, you were dragged from a slave auction in New Orleans, shackled and sold to the highest bidder. They tore your little boy, Josiah, from your arms as though he were nothing more than merchandise. His cries, as he was carried away, still pierce your ears. A rusted nail that will never be pulled free. From that moment, you became property of the Harrowick family, a name that cast a shadow over the entire Yazoo River Valley. Their mansion rose on a hill above the cotton fields, white columns stabbing upward into the blistering Mississippi sky. Inside, the polished floors shone like mirrors, reflecting every footstep, every flicker of candlelight. The family dined beneath portraits framed in gold, their ancestors staring down with hollow authority. They prayed before meals and toasted prosperity with crystal goblets imported from France. And you, unseen, bent over the stove where smoke seared your eyes and heat cracked your hands. You learned to season dishes so perfectly the judge could boast of his Christian household at table, while you hid your voice until it nearly disappeared. Judge Harrowick was respected in court, but merciless at home. He sold children whenever debts grew heavy, He lashed men bloody for working too slowly. Evelyn, his wife, read scripture with a gentle smile, then punished a girl to the brink of collapse for breaking a plate. The lash marks carved into backs at the quarters were their truest family signature. Still, memory refused to fade. Josiah, his tiny hand always curled around your finger, remained the single flame in your chest, night after night, after the dishes were scrubbed and the fire dimmed. You crouched by ashes and traced letters into the dirt. You taught yourself to read scraps of paper carried by the wind. You listened when the plantation doctor visited, repeating words like arsenic, mercury, and dosage until they rooted in your mind. At the general store, you noticed the pale powder sold cheaply as rat poison. Others dismissed it as ordinary. You recognized its power. Over the years, you became something else, still cloaked as a servant, still called by names spat like insults, but beneath it ran a current no one saw. You gathered the powder in hollow gourds, hiding them behind flour sacks. You tested it with trembling hands, a stray dog that faltered after 3 days, a barn cat that shuddered and went still within hours. Each trial terrified you, but none could stop you. Carrying platters into the dining room, you often caught glimpses of Harrowick children, faces innocent and unlined. For a heartbeat, pity tried to settle inside you. Then memory struck Josiah's body, yanked away, his screams unanswered. Their laughter existed only because yours had been silenced. In that instant, even their innocence felt stolen. The kitchen taught you patience. 11 years of silence. 11 years of smoke and servitude. Each feast, each glass raised in smug confidence, deepened the reservoir of hatred inside you. You waited, watched, calculated. You learned the rhythms of their household, their blind spots, their indulgences. And you knew the day would come when you would no longer be invisible, when your hand would reach from the kitchen doorway and overturn the order of things. You already knew the moment the judge's 62nd birthday, when every Harrowick would gather at one long table, their voices bright with confidence. The grandfather clock would chime 7, candlelight would dance against polished silver, and you would stand in the doorway, steady as stone, as the fate you had carried for a decade spilled into their veins with every bite, every swallow, every careless word. The night would not belong to them. It would belong to you. The morning of the feast broke heavy with heat, the kind of August air that pressed down on your chest like a hand. The sky above the Yazoo River glowed the color of tarnished brass, and the cicadas screamed from the trees as though they already sensed what was coming. You woke before dawn, your hands moving through the kitchen as if they belonged to someone else. Flour sifted, onions chopped, duck dressed, and trussed. Every movement had been rehearsed, imagined, dreamed. But this time, there was more than food in your preparations. This time, death traveled with every ladle, every sprinkle, every careful stir. The poison had been waiting for weeks, measured out into tiny paper folds you kept hidden in a hollow gourd behind the flour sacks. You unwrapped them one by one, shaking the powder into sauces and glazes, into the cream for vegetables, into the wine reduction meant to shimmer like ruby glass over the duck. You moved slowly, deliberately, your eyes on the kitchen door, ears tuned for the slightest creak of floorboards. But no one watched you. No one ever truly watched you. That invisibility, sharpened through 11 years of servitude, became your shield and your weapon. You tasted each dish to disguise suspicion. The bitterness of arsenic masked beneath sugar, salt, and wine. You let the flavors roll over your tongue, your face blank, your heartbeat steady. Even as your stomach twisted, you carried the platters into the dining room one by one. The doors swinging open to reveal a tableau of family gathered in silk and satin, their laughter echoing against the high plastered ceiling. The judge sat at the head of the table, his jaw sharp, his eyes cold. He lifted his glass in welcome, his voice booming. To 62 years of prosperity, he declared, while his children and grandchildren clapped politely. His wife Evelyn nodded, pearls glinting at her throat. Servants poured wine. Polished silver caught the candlelight, and the air thickened with the smells of roasted meat and sugared fruit. You stood at the doorway, hands folded neatly over your apron. The words of grace drifted across the table, voices humming in practiced cadence. You mouthed them silently, though your prayer was not theirs. Your prayer was for Josiah, for every child ripped from a mother's arms, for every back scarred until it bled. When the meal began, you stepped forward, placed a duck before the judge, ladling sauce with a hand steady as marble. You offered vegetables slicked with cream, rolls brushed with butter, a cake waiting in the kitchen frosted with sugar that glittered like snow. Each dish carried its invisible burden. Each bite drew them closer to a fate already sealed. At first, nothing. The family ate, their conversations circling cotton prices, social engagements, marriages planned for the autumn. You moved among them silently, refilling glasses, carrying trays. Then the first sign, little Sarah, no more than 9, wrinkled her nose at her vegetables. "They taste funny," she murmured, but her grandmother hushed her. "Nonsense, child. Clara's cooking is perfect." The clock chimed 7:30. The sound stretched into the thick air, each note like a tolling bell. Judge Harrowick raised his glass again, his voice already slurring slightly, though he believed it was the wine. "To family," he declared. His hand trembled just enough that the crystal rattled. Then it began, a cough from the far end of the table, a grimace as someone pressed a hand to their stomach. Another cough, sharper this time, followed by the sound of a glass shattering against the floor. Evelyn turned pale, her hand clutching the edge of the table. The judge blinked rapidly, his face flushed an unnatural purple. The symptoms came like a wave rolling down the table, vomiting, choking, bodies jerking as if yanked by invisible strings. Chairs toppled, dishes clattered, screams tore through the air. Young Sarah collapsed against her plate, her spoon slipping from her hand. Her mother bent to lift her, only to gasp and stumble, her body folding inward. The judge tried to rise, one hand on the table, the other clawing at his throat. The food, he rasped, but his knees buckled. He crashed face first into the frosted cake, smearing sugar across his dying breath. Every eye swung toward you where you stood in the doorway. For one heartbeat, the chaos seemed to freeze, and you felt the weight of their gaze: accusation, horror, recognition. But before a single word could leave their mouths, you turned and slipped back into the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind you. The sound that followed was carnage. Tables overturned, silver clattering like rain, voices shrieking prayers and curses. One of the sons tried to crawl toward the door, dragging his convulsing body across rugs imported from Persia. He collapsed inches from escape, his hand clawing at the wood until it stilled. Evelyn still had enough strength to ring the silver bell meant to summon servants, its high chime cutting through the chaos like a scream. The other enslaved workers heard it clearly from the quarters, but no one came. You moved quickly now, through the scullery and out the back door into the humid night. The air smelled of magnolia and sweat, but beneath it clung the sharp tang of arsenic, as though the poison itself had bled into the very walls. You clutched the bundle you had prepared: spare clothes, a few coins stolen over years, forged papers written with careful hands by candlelight. Behind you, the great house of Harrowick burned not with fire, but with suffering. 12 voices cried out and faltered, one by one, snuffed into silence. You did not look back. The path to the river lay ahead, narrow and swampy, traced by moonlight. For 11 years you had studied it while gathering herbs, memorizing each bend and tree root. Now it was the only road left. And yet, even as you walked, their faces clung to you: the children, the women, the judge choking on his own words. You told yourself it was justice, not murder, that no one at that table was innocent. But the echo of their screams tangled with Josiah's cry in your memory, a chorus that would never release you. By the time the clock struck 9 inside the house you'd left, silence reigned in the dining room. Forks lay abandoned in puddles of wine, chairs overturned, bodies scattered like broken dolls. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock, counting seconds none of them had left. And you, already a mile away, melted into the shadows of the riverbank, carrying not only your bundle, but the weight of every soul you had just erased. You thought it would end that night, that the screams would vanish into the walls of Harrowick and never chase you past the riverbank. But crimes do not stay contained. They bleed, they echo, they reach. And yours was never meant to be just one night. Long before August 1839, you had already been sharpening your blade in silence. The Harrowicks were only the culmination, not the beginning. Years earlier, when you were sold briefly to the Boudreaux estate in Louisiana, you had tested your first plan, their patriarch, a drunkard with a taste for whiskey, died after a night of violent stomach pains. The coroner called it liver failure. You called it justice. You slipped away, resold to another family. Your face forgotten, but your method perfected. At the Lancet household in 1836, the lady of the house succumbed to what the doctor claimed was summer fever. No one asked how her porridge tasted bitter that morning. You did. You counted the hours until her skin flushed red, Her body convulsed, her eyes rolled back. You knew exactly when to stop stirring the pot, when to stand motionless in the doorway and let death perform its slow and methodical work. Each strike was not random. You were following names, ledgers, the faint paper trail of the men who had bartered your son like a coin tossed on a table. You could not find Josiah, but you could dismantle the families who had profited from his loss. The Harrowicks simply gathered too many together at once, too many links in one chain. You broke them all with a single meal. The days that followed were filled with whispers. The enslaved in the quarters, silent witnesses, held their tongues but carried your legend in their eyes. Some said they smiled into their pillows that night. Others trembled at the sound of retching echoing across the house, unsure if vengeance brought freedom or only more chains. But no one moved to warn. No one ran for the doctor. They knew, perhaps before you admitted it to yourself, that your act was larger than a single grudge. By dawn, the plantation resembled a battlefield where no sword had been drawn. 12 bodies cooled around a dining table. A birthday cake sagged under melted wax. Sugar dusted with vomit and blood. The roosters crowed indifferently. The cotton shimmered in the sun, and yet something permanent had shifted in Yazoo County. The natural order had collapsed in a single night, toppled not by an army, but by a cook with steady hands. But vengeance, once loosed, refuses to rest. You carried more than a bundle of clothes as you fled into the swamp that morning. You carried the memory of each face, each scream, each life extinguished. And with it came a hunger. You found yourself replaying the Boudreaux patriarch's last gasps, the Lancet matron's fevered eyes, the Harrowicks clawing at their throats. It was not cruelty that drove you to remember, but precision. You had measured doses, timed effects, and compared outcomes. You had become both avenger and chemist. Your ledger kept in flesh. News traveled fast. Rumors swept through plantations like brush fire. A woman had poisoned an entire family. Some called it witchcraft. Others whispered it was God's punishment. Planters locked their kitchens, demanded slaves taste every dish before serving. Fear rooted itself in every supper table, thicker than the smell of roasted meat. But you were already gone, stepping deeper into the swamps, guided by the moon. Nights became your allies, days your enemies. At water's edge, you washed the flour from your fingernails, though the smell of metal clung no matter how hard you scrubbed. You told yourself you were walking toward freedom, yet your mind plotted names still left unchecked, families whose ledgers bore Josiah's fate. Everywhere you had been sold, death followed. Some overseers died suddenly of ague, others of tainted stew. None of them traced it back to you. No one suspected the quiet figure at the stove who lowered her eyes and stirred the pot. They thought servants invisible. You used that blindness as your weapon. And in the quarters, the enslaved began to murmur. They said you had turned food into fire, that you had shown what power tasted like. Old men prayed thanks into the night air. Women rocked their children tighter, whispering your name like a charm. You were no longer just Eliza. You were the one who seasoned justice. Yet not all who spoke of you did so with reverence. Among the enslaved, some feared what you had unleashed. Retaliation would come, and it would not stop at your absence. Innocents would be whipped, sold, or worse because of what you had done. Already, they said, the Harrowick estate had sent word to neighboring plantations. Riders galloped at dawn, carrying tales of arsenic and betrayal. Still, you pressed forward. By the second night, your bundle felt heavier. Though you had discarded nothing, the weight was in your mind, the recognition that you had crossed a threshold you could never return from. You were not merely a runaway. You were a shadow that carried terror from one plantation to the next. When you reached the edge of the swamp and found the river road, you paused. The Mississippi lay ahead, wide and relentless. Across it stretched lands where whispers of freedom traveled along the Underground Railroad, a path you had only dared to imagine. But you also knew freedom would not erase what you had done. The screams would follow. Back at Harrowick, bodies lay stiff in their finery, mouths frozen mid-prayer. Investigators would come. They would search the kitchen, the quarters, the ledgers. They would find your absence and know the hunt would begin. And when it did, your name would change from servant to monster, from invisible hand to wanted fugitive. You told yourself you were ready, that vengeance justified itself, that every life you ended was only a shadow of the one stolen from you. But in the silence of the swamp, when the frogs croaked and the moon bled silver across the water, doubt whispered, "Did Josiah still live somewhere? Could he forgive the trail of corpses you had left behind in his name?" You quickened your pace. Ahead lay more nights of hiding, more names to strike, more rivers to cross. Behind you, the Harrowick estate stood silent as a mausoleum. But you knew silence is never permanent. It breaks, always, into echoes. And soon, those echoes would rise into the sound of hooves, dogs, and men calling your name through the dark. The silence at Harrowick did not last. By sunrise, a rider had already thundered into Yazoo City, coat flapping, eyes wild with the weight of his story. By noon, the county sheriff rode out with 2 deputies and a doctor, their boots muddy from the rush, their faces set in disbelief. When they entered the great house, the smell of sickness clung to the air like a veil. The dining room looked less like a place of feasting and more like a battlefield where no weapon had been drawn. Only knives laid neatly on plates, crystal cups tipped over in puddles of dark red. You were not there to see it, but you can picture it as clearly as if you had been. The sheriff stepping past bodies and finery, his handkerchief pressed to his mouth. The doctor kneeling to examine the judge's purpled face, lifting an eyelid clouded with death, sniffing the remnants of vomit on the floor. Arsenic, he muttered, without doubt. The word carried like thunder through the chamber. Arsenic meant intent. It meant murder. And all eyes, eventually, would turn toward you. The first interrogation began in the quarters. 6 of your fellow servants were lined up in the yard, the sheriff pacing before them like a judge in open court. He demanded names, explanations, a culprit. Who prepared the meal, he barked. The answers came rehearsed, their voices tight but steady. "We all did, sir." One said she cut vegetables. Another claimed she baked the rolls. Another insisted he served the wine. When pressed about you, their story held fast. You had been sold 2 weeks earlier to a plantation in Louisiana. They even produced papers aged, inked, and signed, though the signature wavered in a hand not quite true. Still, it was enough to plant doubt. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. He had lived his life reading lies on faces, but here he found only masks. These people had mastered invisibility long before you fled. He moved from one to another, searching for the crack, the stammer, the trembling hand. But they had been trained by necessity, trained by you to let nothing slip. Meanwhile, the doctor continued his grim work. He opened the judge's stomach, cut samples from his organs, noted the cherry-red flush of skin, the stiffening hands. His notes recorded every symptom of arsenic poisoning, but they also recorded the impossible scale. This quantity, he told the sheriff, would have required weeks of careful collection. This was no accident. This was designed. Back in town, word spread like fever. Families locked their kitchens at night, suspicious of every servant who touched their food. Housewives forced their cooks to taste every dish before serving. A few dismissed staff entirely, preferring hunger to fear. Even at the courthouse, men whispered over brandy. Voices hushed as they spoke of a woman who had turned the tools of domesticity into instruments of war. The investigation widened. Deputies rode to nearby plantations, asking about a woman of medium height with a scar on her hand. Some claimed to have seen you walking by the river. Others swore you had already crossed into Louisiana. The contradictions only deepened the mystery. No one dared speak the truth that you had been seen slipping into the night with a bundle. That silence was an act of loyalty as much as fear. The sheriff returned to Harrowick, pressing harder. He stormed the kitchen, searching for evidence. The pantry was spotless, every surface scrubbed until wood gleamed. He dug through flour, lifted jars, sniffed spices. In one corner, behind the sacks, he found a gourd, but it was empty, its interior rinsed clean. He cursed and hurled it against the wall. The fragments fell silent at his feet. Suspicion tightened like a noose, but the story your companions told held steady. They swore by the bill of sale, by the letters you had supposedly sent from Louisiana. They cried convincingly, rubbed onions into their eyes to redden them, folded grief into their bodies with such skill, the sheriff almost believed. Almost. And while Yazoo County seethed, you kept moving north. Nights in the swamp bled into nights on hidden roads. You traveled by moonlight, slept beneath cypress trees, listened for dogs and men. You carried forged papers that named you Sarah Coleman, a free woman. You spoke little, lowered your gaze, and passed as someone ordinary. But inside, you knew the hunt was drawing closer. Back at Harrowick, the coroner filed his report. Cause of death, deliberate poisoning. 12 names written in ink. 12 deaths laid at your feet. Yet without a body, without confession, the case sagged under its own weight. Still, the sheriff persisted. He sent telegrams to New Orleans, to Baton Rouge, to plantations across Mississippi. Negro cook. The notice read, approx. 30 years. Scar on left hand. Suspected poisoner. Reward for capture. The community bristled. Some whispered admiration, an enslaved woman who had toppled a dynasty. Others spoke of you as a monster, a demon in human form. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers kept pistols loaded by their bedside. In every home, the act you committed at Harrowick changed the way they sat down to supper. You had become more than a fugitive. You had become a question whispered across the South. What if the cook in your kitchen harbored the same thought? What if the food on your plate was no longer safe? Fear was your echo, louder than your footsteps, traveling farther than you ever could. But investigations do not end in fear. They harden into pursuit. By the second week, bounty hunters rode out with dogs trained to follow scent. Deputies carried scraps of clothing from your cabin, though the smell was muddled with ash and pepper, scattered carefully by your companions. Still, the hunt gained momentum. And in their journals, men like the doctor wrote not only of your crime, but of your precision. This woman, he noted, has an understanding of dosage, of anatomy, of time. Such knowledge cannot be accidental. She listened. She learned. She is more dangerous than a gun. Your name became legend. Your act both condemned and celebrated. But the question grew sharper with each passing day. Would they capture you before you reached the river that divided bondage from breath? Or would you vanish, leaving behind only silence and an empty chair at every southern table? You thought distance might soften the hunt, but every mile north only sharpened it. Notices appeared on courthouse walls and in town squares, describing you in crude detail: Negro woman, about 30, scar on left hand, suspected poisoner. Your face was sketched with rough lines. Your name carried from mouth to mouth like a curse. A reward glittered beneath the words, $2,000. More money than most men would see in a lifetime. By then, you were no longer just Eliza. You were a phantom who had dismantled families across 3 states. A cook who had turned kitchens into battlegrounds. At taverns and markets, planters whispered of you in tones meant to terrify. Some swore you had the devil's help, that you could turn bread to ash and wine to blood with a single touch. Others believed you were already dead, drowned in the Yazoo swamps. But you kept walking, carrying both the lie of your papers and the truth of your mission. The twist came not from the bounty hunters, but from the doctors. When investigators combed through your abandoned cabin, they discovered scraps of paper beneath a loose board in the floor. A journal written in your own hand, coded yet decipherable. Pages filled with lists and calculations. Recipes, but not for food. Measurements of arsenic, times of death, observations of symptoms, and a list of names. At the top, the Boudreaux patriarch, then the Lancet matron, then the Harrowicks, each marked with a date, each followed by a note resolved, sufficient, end complete. But there were more names still unmarked. Men and women tied by blood and marriage to the families that had broken yours. The journal revealed what no one had yet suspected: the Harrowick feast was not your first act, and it was not intended to be your last. News of the journal spread quickly to the white families of Mississippi. It confirmed their worst fears. You had not struck in madness. You had struck with method, with planning, with purpose. You had become something more dangerous than an angry servant. You had become an architect of vengeance. Panic deepened. Kitchens were locked like arsenals. Servants were searched, questioned, beaten. A man could not sip his coffee without wondering if the hand that poured it had written his name in a secret ledger for you. The discovery meant the chase grew even tighter. Bounty hunters doubled. Patrols stretched across counties. Dogs bayed at midnight, their voices carrying through woods where you crouched, holding your breath. Yet the journal, though a risk, also told the truth. Your path was not random. You were following the map of betrayal that began the day Josiah was sold. It was Judge Harrowick's household that bound them all together. Families that had bartered children like you bartered flour. Names tied through contracts and debts. One by one, you had sought them out. And though Josiah's trail had grown cold, your fury kept it burning. Each death was both punishment and prayer, a hope that somewhere, somehow, your child might be spared the cruelty you avenged. But then came a revelation you had not expected. In Cincinnati, a conductor of the Underground Railroad whispered news from Ontario. 2 young women, once enslaved, now free, had opened a school for colored children. Their names were not Josiah, but their ages. Their faces described matched the daughters you had lost years before. Not the son you mourned, but the daughters ripped from you at the auction block. Patience, grace, alive, educated, safe. The words nearly undid you. For the first time since you stepped into the Harrowick kitchen, you faltered. Your hands trembled as you clutched the paper, your heart pounding in your ears. If they lived, if they truly thrived across the border, then every death you had orchestrated had led not only to vengeance, but to survival. For a moment, you imagined crossing into Canada, walking into a schoolhouse, seeing them smile without chains. The thought cut deeper than any blade, yet freedom dangled just out of reach. The bounty hunters were close, their dogs sniffing every road, their eyes scanning every face. You changed your name again, darkened your skin with ash to disguise the fading lie. You stooped your shoulders, bent your back, moved like a washerwoman carrying linens. Still, the risk gnawed at you. The closer you drew to the Ohio River, the louder the footsteps behind you. And then, one night, in a safe house, you made a choice. You wrote a letter, your handwriting curling with that distinctive flourish on every G. You addressed it to the school in Ontario, asking about 2 young teachers. You signed it not as Eliza, not as Sarah Coleman, but with the name you had whispered to yourself for years in the dark Adonai, beloved. That letter was your undoing. Intercession traced. It became the proof bounty hunters needed to close their net. At dawn, boots thundered up a boarding house staircase. Hands hammered at the door. Dogs barked outside. You clutched the vial you had always carried, ready to drink, ready to end it on your terms. But in the rising panic, you hesitated. What if the letter had been answered? What if your daughters truly waded across the river, free and alive? The knock came again, sharper this time. And in that instant, you realized the twist of your story was not that you had killed, but that you had lived long enough to learn there were still things worth dying for. Or perhaps worth surviving. You burst through the back door of the boarding house, lungs burning, the dawn just beginning to bleed, pale light across Cincinnati's cobblestones. Behind you, boots thundered, men shouting your false names: Eliza, Sarah, Adoni, like spells meant to drag you backward. You sprinted through an alley, vaulted a fence, startled chickens exploding into the air. Ahead, the Ohio River unrolled, swollen with September rain, its surface churning like a restless beast. 7 men closed in. A bounty hunter looped rope in his hands. The deputy marshal raised his pistol. They thought they had you cornered at the edge of the pier, nowhere left to run. But you still held the vial hidden in your bodice, the one that had followed you from the kitchen at Harrowick to this final moment. You raised it high. Their voices faltered. The crowd that had gathered, dock workers, free blacks, even curious whites, watched in silence. You spoke then. Your words carried by river wind. You call me poison, but I was only ever a mother. You told them of children sold like cattle, of prayers left unanswered, of nights spent in chains while others feasted. And now, you said, the law offers me only 2 choices: die by their hands or by my own. The river growled against the pilings. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. You pressed the vial to your lips, but at the last moment, you let it fall. It shattered against the wood, the powder scattering like ash into the water. And then you leapt. Cold swallowed you whole. Darkness pressed from all sides. Above, men shouted. Ropes splashed. Dogs barked. But the river carried you, pulled you beneath, rolled you toward freedom or death. No body was ever found. Days later, fishermen pulled up empty nets, whispering that the current had claimed you forever. Yet stories began to spread. A woman seen boarding a train to Chicago. Another teaching letters by candlelight in a hidden school. Some said you drowned. Others swore you lived, years later. The Harrowick estate stood in ruins, ivy clawing through broken windows, the dining table still scarred by stains that would never wash away. Locals said that on humid nights in August, if you walked too close, you could still hear the sound of forks scraping plates and the faint choke of a man raising a poisoned toast. And you, whether alive or only a legend, became more than flesh. You became the question whispered whenever supper was served. What if the cook is not feeding you, but watching you die? So tell me, if you had stood in that doorway, hearing the family convulse, seeing their mouths foam and their hands claw for air, would you have run to help them? Or would you have stayed, silent, and let justice season the feast? Before you go, hit subscribe, because stories like this are far from over. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching so we know you're still out there. listening in the dark,